Hey, what would your life be like if you were blind? I know it's kind of an odd question, but just go with me for a second. What would your life be like if you couldn't see? What sort of limitations, if you think about your life, what sort of limitations would you have? What sort of challenges would you face in particular? What sort of frustrations might you have? Questions about the world if you couldn't see? That was exactly the story of a guy by the name of William Tandy. He was born blind, lived as a blind man for 70 years of his life. So for 70 years, he experienced those limitations. For 70 years, he experienced those frustrations. For 70 years, he had those questions. What would life look like if I could see? And then it happened. A medical breakthrough when he's 70 years old gave him sight, gave him the ability to do something that he'd never been able to do. He was able to see for the very first time. And people in his life asked him, they said, "Hey, William, what's it like now that you can see? What's changed?" And of course, he had a lot of things to say, but one of the things he said stuck with me. He said, "Hey, look, I'm the same guy. I'm the same me, and I'm in the same place. I've always been here, same me, same place. But now that I can see, everything is different. Same guy, same place, but now that I can see, everything around me, the world is completely different." If you've been around with us this summer, you know that we've been doing this series. We've been looking at different encounters from different people that they have with Jesus. And maybe more importantly, we've been kind of reflecting on what happens as a result of a genuine encounter with Jesus. And tonight, this kind of last encounter that we're gonna look at, we're gonna look at someone who had a lot in common with William Tandy. Because this guy too knew what it was like to live as a blind man. He knew the limitations, he knew the frustrations, he had the questions. And just like William Tandy, something happened in his life and everything changed. So we'll pick up the story in John chapter 9, verse 1. John tells us this: as Jesus went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus, "but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world." So let's recap for a second, because what John tells us is that Jesus and his disciples are walking along and they see a man, they see a blind man, but the thing about it is Jesus doesn't see this man like everyone else sees him. Everyone else, when they see this guy, what they see is a problem. It's why they asked Jesus, "Hey, who sinned?" It's kind of an odd question for us, I think, but in the first century, it was kind of common because there was this thought that there was a direct cause and effect relationship between suffering and sin, hardship and sin, pain and sin. And what that meant is that people in the first century, they thought that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And because being blind is bad, it means that something or someone must have done something wrong. At least that's how they saw it. But the thing about it is that's not how Jesus sees it. Jesus doesn't see it that way. And Jesus doesn't see this man that way. Because look at what Jesus says. He says, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." See, in other words, Jesus says that there was purpose in his pain. Catch that. Jesus says there was purpose in his pain. Jesus saw the bigger picture. He saw the bigger story that God was writing. And so what he's saying is that his pain, it's not random. His hardship, it's not chance. No, it had a purpose. Jesus is saying that there's a "so that." Now, let me just pause here and say that this is one of the hardest things I think about the Bible. It's one of the hardest teachings of the Bible that God in his infinite goodness, God in his infinite wisdom sometimes allows his people to go through hardship and suffering. Why? So that they can experience his grace, so they can experience his mercy, so they can experience his deliverance. And so Jesus says to this man that his pain had purpose, and I think that's good news because it means that so does ours. 2,000 years later, so does yours. See, whatever's happened to you, whatever's happening in your life, maybe whatever will happen, the takeaway in these opening verses is that with God, there's always a so that. Now, I'm smart enough to know that you're maybe wondering, okay, is it really that simple? And on the one hand, no, of course not, right? I'm not trying to presume that it's easy. I know that you guys have gone and are going through and will go through some really hard things. So I'm not up here trying to pretend like, yeah, it's, just got a purpose, so no big deal. No, it's hard. It's really hard. But I want you to hear this. Jesus knows your pain. Jesus knows your pain, not just because he created you, though he did, and knows every single thing about you. Every single thing about your life because he created you. Not only does he know you because of that, but he also knows your pain because he knows what it's like to experience it himself. I mean, just think about the cross. Betrayed, beaten, bloodied, broken. Why? So that we could receive grace. So that we could receive mercy, so that we could be saved, so that we could have life. Let me just say, I'm not up here to pretend like I know exactly what God is doing in your life. I'm not gonna act like I know why you're going through the thing you're going through, or why you will go through the thing, or why the thing that you went through had to happen. I don't know the specifics of your pain, the specifics of your hardship, the specifics of your suffering, but I do know this. I'm confident that there's a so that. And whatever that so that is, it's ultimately for your good. It's ultimately for your good. The story continues in verse 6. John says, after saying all of that, Jesus spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, kind of gross, and rubbed it on the man's eyes, even worse. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. That word, it means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the man who used to sit and beg? Some of them claimed he was. Others said, no, it just looks like him. But the guy himself, he insists, I am the man. Well, then how were your eyes open, they asked. He replied, well, the man they called Jesus, he made some mud and put it on my eyes and told me to go to a pool and wash. And so I went and I washed, and then I could see. Where is this guy, they asked. I don't know. So just picture that convo for a second, right? Like it's somewhat comical to me because what you have is you have a group of people who presumably have seen this guy a lot, right? And they say, look, isn't this the beggar? Isn't this guy the guy that we pass by on the street all the time? Some say yes, others say no, it can't be. It's just some imposter, some lookalike, some fake. It's not that guy because, it's not him. And then the guy's over here saying, yeah, it's me, right? Yeah, it's me. It's me. Then they're like, okay, fine, well then how can you see? Because you used to not be able to see, and that's weird. How can you see? And the guy says, well, let me tell you a story. Some dude named Jesus spits on the ground, makes some mud, rubs it on my eyes, gross, tells me to jump into a pool, and out I come, and now I can see. Where is this guy? I don't know. It's bizarre. And it wasn't good enough for the people because we read in the next set of verses this. It says, they brought to the Pharisees the man who'd been blind. Now, on the day which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes, it was a Sabbath. Therefore, the Pharisees also asked him how he received his sight. Here we go again. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. Then they turn to the blind man and they say, well, what have you to say about him? It was your eyes that he opened. And the man replies, I don't know. He's a prophet. Okay, so let's pause again because this is kind of the second major conversation that's happening. First, it's he's being questioned by his neighbors. Now he's being questioned by the Pharisees. Who are the Pharisees? Some of you know the Pharisees were a relatively small and yet highly influential group of Jewish religious leaders that taught meticulous obedience to God, right? That's kind of a simple description of who they are. And they take issue with what Jesus has done. In particular, it says in verse 16, they take issue with the fact that what Jesus is doing, it says he does not keep the Sabbath. In other words, he healed a guy on the Sabbath. And to them, that meant that he was a religious lawbreaker. He's a religious lawbreaker because if you remember, if you've read the Old Testament or the book of Exodus, or maybe you're just familiar with the 10 Commandments, you know that God in the Old Testament, he gives the Israelites the 10 Commandments. And the fifth commandment is to keep the Sabbath, to keep it holy, to set apart one day a week for rest and worship of God. And this commandment, it was meant to be kind of a life-giving, restful command, something that brought flourishing to his people. But the thing about it is, they're frustrated. The Pharisees are frustrated with Jesus because they think Jesus is violating that command. But Jesus wasn't violating the command to observe the Sabbath. He was violating the command that the Pharisees had made into kind of more of a tradition for them. And what I mean by that is they took this life-giving thing that God had commanded his people, this life-giving, restful, worshipful thing, set apart a day, and they made it burdensome. They made it the opposite of life-giving. They added a bunch of rules and a bunch of fine print, and according to their fine print, what Jesus was doing was wrong. According to their rules and their regulations, there's like 39 different classifications of rules of things that they added to what God had said about what people couldn't do on the Sabbath. And so they're frustrated, or at least a group of them are frustrated with what Jesus did because apparently healing on the Sabbath was a no-no. Except not everybody agrees. Because look at the second half of verse 16. Look what it says. Some of them were frustrated because he's doing this on the Sabbath, but others, it says, well, how can a sinner? He can't be a sinner if he performs such signs like this. And so there's division. Neighbors thought one thing, Pharisees thought another. Now there's a group of people wondering, well, a sinner can't do signs like this. And so finally, what do? They just like go to the source. Okay? You tell us. Well, what do you say? The guy says, he's a prophet. That's his response. I don't know, he's a prophet. Now, I want to pause here because it's kind of interesting. The first several times I read through this passage, I missed this, and I think it's really easy to miss. I want you to notice that there's a progression already starting to happen with this guy. Because earlier in this passage, what does the guy call Jesus? He calls him some guy, right? Basically, that man they call Jesus. That's how he refers to Jesus. When they say, who did this to you? He says, the man they call Jesus. Now he's saying Jesus is a prophet. And what we'll see later is that he finally calls him Lord. And because he's Lord, he eventually worships him. Okay, what's your point, Kyle? Well, my point is that this guy is coming to Jesus in steps. That there's a process. That he doesn't have it all figured out. That he's coming to Jesus in this story little by little. It's a process, day by day, little by little, he's starting to see Jesus for who he really is. And I don't know about you, but when I read things like that, I find encouragement in it because I see a little bit of my own story in this guy's story. I see a little bit of myself in this man who doesn't have it all figured out, doesn't have all the questions answered, doesn't have a spot-free life. I mean, I don't know, maybe you do too. Maybe that's your own story, or maybe you're finding encouragement right now because you too know, hey, I don't have it all figured out. Man, it seems like other people here do, but I don't, and I feel a little embarrassed about that. I want you to be encouraged because I think what Jesus is saying is that it's okay to be in process. It's okay to have questions. It's okay to have doubts. It's okay to not have it all figured out. It's okay to be a little bit messy, but here's the thing. Are we taking steps forward? Are we taking steps toward Jesus, or are we taking steps away from Jesus? You don't have to have it all figured out, but Jesus does want us taking steps toward him. Little by little, day by day. I don't know. I find encouragement in that. But the Pharisees, they're not encouraged, they're not convinced. So we pick up verse 18. It said they still didn't believe that this guy had been blind and had received sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son, they asked? Is this the one that you say was born blind? How is it that he can see? So you see what's happening, right? They go to the guy's parents and say, is this your kid? Was he blind? How can he see now? Verse 20, we know he's our son, the parents answered. That's kind of weird, right? Yeah, we know that's our kid. And we know he was born blind. But how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age, he'll tell you. He'll speak for himself. Again, it's kind of odd, right? Like religious leaders go to parents and say, is this your kid? Yeah, it's my boy. Well, then how can he see? He was blind. Yeah, he was blind. He can see. I don't know how. Go to ask him. He'll tell you. It's kind of weird, right? Like surely they talked. Why do they respond like that? Why do these parents have this response to these religious leaders? John tells us actually in verse 22, it says this. It says that his parents said this. They responded like that. Why? Because they were afraid. They were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Why? Because they'd already decided that anyone that acknowledged Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. So that's why his parents said, he's of age, ask him. So John tells us, why didn't they answer? Why didn't they just answer the question that they likely knew the answer to? Well, it says because they were afraid. They were afraid. Afraid of who? The religious leaders. That's kind of messed up. They were afraid of religious leaders. They were afraid of being kicked out of the synagogue, which was their church. They're afraid of being kicked out of church. Why? Why is that a big deal? Well, because synagogue, yes, was a place to worship, but it was also a place of community. And so to be kicked out of church was to be kicked out of kind of your people, basically. And so they're afraid of religious leaders, of being kicked out of a church, but more importantly, they're afraid of being socially ostracized. They're afraid of being alone. So they say some weird stuff. And I think it's true. Fear sometimes makes us do and say stupid things, doesn't it? Parents included, I am one, right? I say stupid things because I'm afraid sometimes. That's exactly what happens with these parents. So the Pharisees are like, fine, I guess we'll go back to the blind guy. So this is what they say, verse 24, or what we see. It says, the second time, they summon the man who'd been blind. And they say to him, give glory to God by telling the truth. We know this guy's a sinner. Talking about Jesus. The blind man replies, I don't know, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. Here's what I know. I was blind, and now I see. Whether or not he's a sinner, I have no idea. That's not my issue. Here's what I know. I've been blind my entire life. I've experienced the limitations of a blind man my entire life. I've experienced the hardship of a blind man my entire life. I've experienced the questions, the limitations, the frustration of being a blind man my entire life, but now I see. Now I see. He's been in the same place he's always been, but everything changed. Everything's different. Why? Because Jesus changed him. Jesus changed him. Remember what Jesus said about himself? He said he's the light of the world. While he's in the world, he's the light of the world. The light of the world gave this man light, brought light to physical darkness. He was blind, but now he can see. That's what Jesus does. That's what Jesus always does. When his light shines, when the light of Jesus shines in our lives, what happens is that we're made to see. And when we see Jesus for who he really is, it changes us. When we catch a glimpse, Ella said this earlier, when we catch a glimpse of who Jesus is, it changes us. Maybe not totally, but little by little, more and more over time, when we see Jesus, when his light shines in our lives, when we see him for who he really is, not who other people say he is, but when we actually see him for who he really is, it changes us. Or at least it should. And I say that because it raises an uncomfortable question. And that uncomfortable question is when you think about your life, has anything really changed? Is anything really changing about your life as you're seeing Jesus? I've shared this before. Back in 2017, there was an op-ed in the New York Times, and I think about it often because it had one of those kind of question headlines that caught my attention. Here's just a screenshot of it, and yeah, you can see it, right? It's a good hook. Is your God dead? This is the New York Times op-ed. And I think about that a lot. And if the hook works and you go and read the article, what you find out is that the guy that is writing the article wrote it because in his experience, what he was seeing in his own life were a bunch of so-called Christians not really living any differently than everybody else around them. His life, one guy, right? So this is not a pronouncement of all Christians in all places, but he writes this op-ed in the New York Times asking the question of Christians, is your God dead? Because what he sees in his own life is a bunch of people pretending to be Christians but not really following Jesus. Or maybe following Jesus only when it's convenient, or only when it's comfortable, or only when they agree with that particular version of Jesus. And so he goes on to just wonder, well, okay, if this is who Jesus' followers are, then this Jesus guy must not be someone we're following, or he's not real, or he's dead. I don't know, provocative question, yeah? I think it raises that tough question. I think it raises the question of what do people see when they look at our lives? What do people see? Think about that. What do people see when they look at your life? What do your lives say about Jesus? Think about your summer, these last 4 weeks, 5 weeks, whatever it is. What does your summer say about Jesus? What are the jobs that you've been working this summer? How you've been doing them? The work ethic or the honesty or the integrity or what does that say about Jesus? What does your schoolwork say? How you do your schoolwork? What does that say about? What about your relationships? What are the choices that you're making in your relationships? What do those things say about Jesus? What about your friendships? What do your friendships say about Jesus? Your weekends, your free time. What does all that say about Jesus? Hard questions, yeah? Uncomfortable questions. But the reality is that seeing Jesus should change us. And if we're not changing, maybe we don't actually really see Jesus for who he really is. See, this guy in John chapter 9, he says, look, I was blind and now I see. Everything has changed. But again, the Pharisees aren't done. Verse 26 says, then they ask him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? I'm laughing because here we go again. And the guy says, I've already told you, and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to be his disciples too? Kind of some sarcasm there, right? Then they hurled insults at him. They didn't like that. You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. The man answers, now that's remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes? We know that God doesn't listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody's ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were from God, I was right the first time. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. To this they replied, you are steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. They didn't like what he had to say. You are steeped in sin. See, they go back to this good people, good things, bad people, bad things, right? There's a bad thing happening in your life. You must have been in sin from the moment you were born, and you've continued to be in sin every day since. If you've been wondering where Jesus is at in all this, it's kind of weird, right? Because like Jesus spits on some mud and heals a guy, and then he bounces from the story, and it's like, where are you at, dude? Well, he finally comes back, verse 35. Jesus hears that they threw this guy out, and when he found him, he said, do you believe? This is the question he has for the man. Do you believe in the Son of Man? Son of Man is just a phrase, title that Jesus liked to use to describe himself. It's kind of one of his favorite things to say about himself. Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I might believe in him. And Jesus says, catch this, you've now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. The man said, Lord, I believe. And then he worshiped. So there it is. Lord, I believe. And he worships him. See, first he was a man, and then he was a prophet, and now he's a Lord. I believe. And he does the only thing that is appropriate when you see Jesus for who he really is. He worships him. See, I think it's interesting. A lot of people saw Jesus. They didn't worship him. A lot of people knew Jesus. A lot of people were around Jesus. A lot of people saw Jesus and spent a lot of time with Jesus, and yet not a lot of people worshiped him. And I think that is because seeing is not necessarily the same as believing. Seeing is not necessarily, you can get a glimpse of Jesus, but not really believe he is who he says he is. It's believing. Believing is what opens our eyes to see the glory and the majesty and the beauty of who Jesus is. It's believing. Last few verses, picking up 39. Jesus said, "For judgment I've come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, "What? Are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, well, your guilt remains." It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Jesus is basically saying, look, if you knew you were blind, well, then you'd be able to see. But because you think you can see, you're actually blind. Now, of course, what Jesus is talking about, he's, spiritually speaking, right? You thought you could see, and because you think you can see, you actually can't. It's only until we realize that we're blind that we can actually see. The point is that the Pharisees missed it. They missed Jesus. They thought that they could see, but Jesus says that they don't actually see him at all. These are religious leaders, right? You don't see it all, Jesus says to them. You're spiritually blind. See, here's the takeaway tonight. If you brought your journal, write it down, snap a shot. Well, don't. I'm not going to put it up on the screen. Just remember this. It's only that when we realize how blind we really are, that God will give us eyes to see Jesus for who he really is. It's only when we realize how blind we really are that God gives us eyes to see Jesus for who he really is. So are we blind? Or do we think that we can see? Do we recognize that we have a great need, or do we think that we're doing okay? Jesus says, only until you realize you're blind will you have eyes to see who I really am. And seeing Jesus for who he really is really does change us. This is a photo of a woman in front of a Rembrandt painting. I think over in Europe somewhere. I don't remember how long ago, but basically she has a terminal illness, and her dying wish was to see a Rembrandt painting. She'd never seen one, was a big fan, but she wanted to see the beauty. She wanted to see the skill. She wanted to see the majesty of a Rembrandt. And so this was her dying wish. Now, this is a very different photo, but that painting in the background is also a Rembrandt photo. Now, here's what I'm not doing. I'm not trying to shame anyone for being on their phones. I don't care. That's not the point, right? I don't care how old they are. I wish they were old people, because old people would do the same thing. The point is the juxtaposition, right? When you think about those images side by side, and when you have, on the one hand, you have a woman whose dying wish is to see a Rembrandt, the beauty, the majesty, the glory, the skill of a Rembrandt painting. Side by side with a group of people who that painting's not even worth paying attention to. I don't know what they're doing on their phones, but they're distracted, right? Not paying attention. See, the same thing was happening. I share those images because the same thing's happening in the passage tonight. Jesus was standing right in front of those religious leaders. That's what the whole story is about. Jesus is standing right in front of those religious leaders, and they missed him. They missed him. Right in front of them. They could see Jesus, but they couldn't really see him because they had their heads down. They were distracted. And so I think that leads to a question that I want to just leave you with tonight. Is that you? As you think about your life, are you distracted when it comes to Jesus? Are you just going through the motions with respect to what it means to follow him? Is Jesus really that worth paying attention to? Or maybe to ask it a different way, what's distracting you? What when you think about your life, maybe this next week, maybe this week, right? What's distracting you from Jesus? What's keeping your head down? Davis 3-4 weeks ago, the very beginning of the summer. He kicked us off, and in that talk, he asked a question, or actually gave us a prompt, an invitation. It was Jesus' invitation. Jesus said to some of the disciples, he said, come and see. Come and see who I am. Come and see who I am. And that was kind of the invitation to us for this whole summer of encounters with Jesus, coming to see Jesus. And Jesus is saying a similar thing to us tonight, except he's not saying come and see. He's saying, don't miss me. I'm right here. Don't miss me. So this is our last night, and so I'll just leave you with that. Don't miss Jesus. What Jesus wants from you is he wants you to look up. What if you just ask God to give you the eyes to see Jesus for who he really is, to see his beauty, to see his majesty, to see his glory, so that you would want him above all else? What would change about your life if that were true? My guess is a lot. Let's pray that that would happen. Jesus, I'll be the first to admit that often I think that I can see clearly, when in reality I have no idea that I'm blind. And I pray right now in front of all these people that you would forgive me for my pride, for my foolishness, for my sin. Oh God, open the eyes of my heart so that I could see you, really see you for who you really are. And I pray the same for my friends here tonight, that we would, as a community of people, that we would see you more clearly, and that seeing you little by little, day by day, step by step, that the more that we see you, the more clearly we see you, the more that we would want you above all else. Oh, Jesus, help us to see you. And as we do, live our lives in worship of you. It's in your name we pray.